Welcome, everyone, to the Hank Greenberg 110th birthday virtual symposium from SABR Detroit. I'm Nathan Bierma of SABR Detroit and TigersHistory.com. Thrilled to have so many of you joining us. Hank was a New Year's Day baby, so we're a little late in celebrating, but it's never too late to celebrate and to talk about his wonderful career and his legacy. In a moment, we will hear from Herm Krabbenhoft on his research into Hank Greenberg's RBI totals. But first, a few preliminaries. Check the chat window for a link to our online schedule and program. As you can see that coming up at 2 o'clock, we have a panel with Steve Greenberg, Aviva Kempner, and John Rosengren. Also at that link, we have some bonus online content that's available for listening later, including interviews with Erwin Cohen, Ron Kaplan, and a photo gallery of the Hank Greenberg Walk of Heroes at Michigan and Trumbull in Detroit, the site of Tiger Stadium. I also put a link there to download Herm's slides so that while he's talking, you can refer to them. And I'm going to try a few trivia questions throughout our afternoon today. And the prizes are a couple cards of Hank Greenberg. These are not valuable cards. These are recent cards. They're not vintage, but they're just very beautiful, very cool looking.
This is going to be unbelievable.
This is the Panini.
Everything's good. It's just.
Or I should let you focus. He'll tell me later.
All right. Can everybody hear me okay? In a moment, I'm going to mute
Yeah, she's trying. It's just bunchy.
all other participants.
No, he just peed.
I got to find the mute all, but I will soon. Go ahead and mute your microphone, unless you're Herm, and we'll go from there. As I was saying, so Panini Diamond Kings does these beautiful cards. This is the 2019 of Hank Greenberg. This is the 2020 card, and I've been acquiring multiple copies of these just because they're such great gifts. So this is your prize, and the first question, which I will post in the chat window. And if you've recently viewed the life and times of Hank Greenberg, if you know Hank's career, I'm sorry this is too easy, but here you go. Hank Greenberg homered in each game of a doubleheader on July 30, 1938, his 36th and 37th home runs of the season. Who was the winning pitcher in both games? Don't shout it out. Type it into the chat window, and our first correct answer will receive that card. We're going to talk, as I mentioned, about RBIs, and I want to, I'll share my screen here so you can see. All right, can everyone view my screen? Can everybody see my my slides here? Okay. And I want to get into slide view. I'll just do that then. To talk about RBIs, it might surprise some of you to know that we're going to talk about RBIs this way, because it's a stat that has fallen out of favor for reasons that we'll discuss. I was surprised to find that Branch Rickey was one of the first to call into question the validity of this statistic. He called it misleading in terms of what it represented. This is quoted in Keith Law's book, Smart Baseball. His chapter on the RBI is called Baseball's Unreliable Narrator. Now, the problem, of course, is that RBI is actually a team accomplishment. It takes runners on base ahead of you to get an RBI unless you're hitting a solo home run. So to attribute RBIs as an individual accomplishment is a flawed approach. We might say that the more promising or the more accurate statistics measure this today are batting average with runners in scoring position, Bill James's runs created, or most promising, I think, win probability added, WPA. Now, Hank Greenberg, of course, didn't have those statistics available to him. He had RBI, and this was significant to him. I was really struck, and Herm will give us this complete quote in just a second. But Hank Greenberg, in Life of Times and in his autobiography with Ira Berkow, says, I was primarily concerned with and concentrated on driving in runs. And I was really struck to read in either John Rosengren's biography or Ron Kaplan's book on Hank's 1938 season that Hank himself was more proud of his RBI total and his chase for Lou Gehrig's record in 1937 than he was of his home run chase in 1938. That really struck me. But as he saw it, the primary goal of a clutch hitter was to drive in those runs. One Detroit Tiger slugger who would agree with Hank, notably, is Miguel Cabrera, and he gave this interesting article, interesting interview a few years ago, and I'll post the link to this. And once again, I'm going to mute other participants in a minute. I think there's a mute all other participants, but please mute your own microphone in the meantime, as we're getting a lot of other feedback. Miguel Cabrera, a few years ago, I think back in 2015, said, here's what I see as the most important thing as a hitter. Your batting average can go up and down. You can't control that. Home runs, I always played in big ballparks. Comerica Park notoriously swallows would-be home runs. So I don't worry too much about home runs, but RBIs, I feel a little more proud of that, because if you produce and produce, I can tell you somebody is going to look for you to have a job. Miguel Cabrera did not need to worry about employability at that point, but he said this is the most important thing, is to drive in runs. And Herm reminded me that in 2019, Albert Pujols homered for his 2000th career RBI at Comerica Park, and he said something very similar. He said the most important thing to do as a hitter is to drive in those runs with runners on base. So even though from an analytics standpoint, we would say the RBI is a flawed or incomplete statistic, this was a big deal. RBIs were a very big deal to Hank Greenberg. They continue to be a very big deal to some of the preeminent sluggers of our day. I'm going to stop my screen, and now I want to hand the ball over to Herm Krabbenhoft. I realize I neglected to write up a formal bio of you, Herm, but I just want to say he's an eminent researcher. He is tireless and thorough, and it's unbelievable what he unearths. He's a longtime member of SABR. His fingers are on some of SABR's most extensive and significant research. And also, Herm will undersell the importance of what he found when it comes to 1937. So let me oversell it, or at least give it, let me at least give it justice. Herm single-handedly found, and as he might say, he almost accidentally found, that Hank Greenberg's famous RBI total, which Hank cherished so much, of 183, was actually incorrect. And Herm will tell us how many Hank actually had, and he'll also tell us, I believe, where he stands in relation to Lou Gehrig as a result. But it was Herm's tireless research into game-by-game results from not just the 37 seasons, but others, that just 10 years ago, 2011, led almost all leading baseball statistic keepers to recognize a revised total for Hank Greenberg's RBI total. So Herm, we'd love to hear from what you have to show us, and if you would go ahead and share your screen. Again, I'll post the link to the site, to the slides. You can download them. I will also mute all other participants on the call. If you're not yet muted, go ahead and do that. But Herm, we are seeing your slides now, or we're seeing your screen now. And so go ahead and open your slides and take it away.
Okay, let me get to the thing here. And I'm going to go up to show.
And Herm, I just accidentally unmuted, or I accidentally muted you. So go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay.
There. Yep. Now we can hear you.
Now, for some reason, my my slides are no longer working here. I can't. Let me view slideshow. Can people hear me, or?
Yep, all set.
Okay. Now, okay. Nathan, thank you so much for the kind introduction and the invitation to present here at the Symposium in honor of Hank Greenberg. And thank everybody who has tuned in to participate in the presentation. I want to start by referring to what Casey Stengel often said is, you can look it up. And but if you go to Major League Baseball's official records, you will sometimes encounter misinformation in the records. And what I'm going to talk about today is the errors that I have found and corrected in the Major League Baseball records for Hank Greenberg, in particular for his runs batted in numbers and runs scored numbers. The first couple charts that I'm going to present will give you why I did this. It's not because I wanted to find out about Hank Greenberg. It's because back in 1961, I picked up my first copy of the Little Red Book of Baseball, and I was intrigued by two records that were in this record book. The first is consecutive games runs scored, which I term C-Grun streak, consecutive games run scored streaks. The 1961 Red Book, the leaders, the record holders were Nellie Fox in the American League with a 19-gamer and Ted Kluszewski in the National League with a 17-gamer. The other record that captured my attention was the consecutive games run batted in record, which I term C-Grunby, consecutive games run batted in streaks. According to Red Book, Little Red Book, in 61, the National League record holder was Mel Ott, and the American League record holder was Lou Gehrig. And I asked myself a question back then, well, who has the longest C-Gruns and C-Grunby streaks by Tigers players? Well, I didn't get around to doing anything to find it out until the 2000s. And by that time, I had been made aware that the official records are not always reliable. And I needed, for my work, for what I wanted to find out, I needed accurate runs scored and runs batted in information on a game-by-game basis, because I'm looking for consecutive game streaks. So I decided to use a three-step procedure to do this, using the game accounts in the Detroit News, Detroit Free Press, Detroit Times, as well as the newspapers in the cities that where the Tigers played or their opponents. I obtained the complete details for each and every run the Tigers scored. This goes from 2007 back to 1905. The second step was to compare my game-by-game runs scored and runs batted in numbers with the corresponding numbers in the official day-by-day records. And that allowed me to ascertain which official run scored numbers and run batted in numbers are accurate and which are not accurate. For those that were not accurate, I provided the pertinent documentation to Seymour Seawolf and Steve Hurt of the Elias Sports Bureau, to Pete Palmer, whose database was used in Total Baseball and the ESPN Baseball Encyclopedia, and it's currently used by RetroSheet and by Baseball Reference. And I also provided the information to Dave Smith and Tom Ruane of RetroSheet for their independent reviews. The results: for each run scored inaccuracy in the official records that I discovered, there was 100% concurrence with my conclusions, and the appropriate corrections were effected by Elias, by Palmer, and by RetroSheet. That's pleasing. With each run batted inaccuracy that I discovered, Palmer and Smith and Ruane concurred 100% with my conclusions, and the appropriate corrections were effected by Palmer and by RetroSheet. Let me go on to the next slide here. Run scored errors. This is the first slide on this, but let me just give you a little bit of background. I'm going to talk about the runs scored and runs batted in errors that I discovered and corrected during Hank Greenberg's time with the Tigers. So it goes from does not include 1930, when he only appeared in one game late in the season in his Major League debut. It goes from 1933 through 1946, with the exception of the years he was in this military service, full years in the military service, 42 through 44. So 1933, there was one game with a run scored error for the Detroit Tigers. It involved two players, Charlie Gehringer and John Stone. The official records show Gehringer with one runs scored, and Stone with 3 runs scored. In actuality, Gehringer had 2 runs scored and Stone had 2 runs scored. And the consequence of that is that Gehringer actually scored 104 runs, not 103, and Stone actually scored 85, not 86. Looking at 1934, again, well, this time there were 4 games with RBI errors involving 6 players. Gehringer was again involved in an RBI error. And this one is particularly significant because the official records show him with 1 when he actually scored 2 runs in that 9-14 game, but it affects his season total. And Gehringer led the American League in runs scored that year with an actual total of 135, not 134, as shown in the official records. In 1935, Hank Greenberg makes his appearance in the runs scored error group. In the game on August 28th, Roxy Lawson actually scored 1 run, but the official record showed him with 0. Hank Greenberg actually scored, I can't see that. How do I get rid of these things here? All these people are blocking the, okay. So Greenberg, the official records show Greenberg with 1. He actually scored none. And so for his full season, Greenberg actually had 120 runs scored, not 121. There were no, now, oh, I see what boy, this is confusing here. There we go. There were no run scored errors for the Tigers in 1936. There was 1 in 1937. It involved a player named Gil English and Billy Rogel. 1938 is an important one. There was 1 game with a run scored error. It involved both Rudy York and Hank Greenberg. Greenberg was officially credited with 4 runs scored. He actually scored only 3. And this is particularly important because in 1938, Greenberg led the American League in runs scored with an actual total of 143, not 144. 1939, another run scored error game for the Tigers. And again, it involved Hank Greenberg. The official record showed 2. He actually scored only 1. Guy Walker was shown with 1. He actually scored 2. So for the season, Greenberg actually scored 111 runs, not 112. 1940, there was 1 game. It involved Buck Newsome and Billy Sullivan. There were no run scored errors in 1941. So let's, and since Greenberg was in the military service for all of 42, 3, and 4, let's move on to 45. There were 3 games with runs scored errors in 1945. 1 of them involved Hank Greenberg. The official record showed him with 2. He actually had 1. Therefore, for the season, he had 46, not 47. Likewise, in 1946, while there were 4 games with run scored errors, Greenberg was involved in 1. The game on 9/18, he is shown, the official records show him scoring a run. He did not score a run. Pat Mullen scored a run. The reason for this particular mix-up is that Pat Mullen was a pinched runner for Greenberg who had doubled. And so Greenberg couldn't have scored, and he didn't. For the season, Greenberg scored 90 runs, not 91, as shown in the official records. Let me summarize the runs scored situation for the Detroit Tigers during this period of 1933 through 46, excepting the military years, 42 through 44. Total of 19 games with run scored errors, 37 run scored errors in those 19 games involving 23 players. Hank Greenberg was involved in the most. He had 5 run scored errors. He lost a run in each of those for a -5 overall net effect. For his career with the Tigers, he ended up with 975 runs scored, not 980 as shown in the official records. All of these numbers the corrected numbers, the actual numbers, they're what is shown based on my research on Baseball Reference and Retrosheet. Okay, now we're going to switch over to RBIs. I want to just make a comment following up what Nathan said in the beginning, yeah, RBIs are important, and yeah, they are. They do depend on where you are in the batting order, and your teammates that would get on base who were obviously batting in front of you. But the batting order is put together because of what you have achieved in the past. If you are known to drive in runs, you're going to be put in the third and fourth and fifth holes of the batting lineup. That's why you're there. And I understand about it's dependent on who's in front of you, but it all works together. The best will get, the cream will rise to the top. Okay, so now with RBIs, there's going to be a lot more RBI errors than there were run scored errors. And let me just give you a little history of Major League Baseball's rules on RBIs. Prior to 1920, there were no RBIs, no official RBIs. There were certain people who batted in runs, but there were no official RBIs. They were not tabulated. So there was nothing official. The first rule for RBIs, Major League Baseball's first rule was in 1920, and it lasted unchanged until 1930. And it's these words: the summary shall contain, the number of runs batted in by each batsman. That's it. That's all the guidance and governance that the Major League Baseball provided to official scorers during the period from 1920 to 1930. So they were essentially free to use their own judgment as to what constituted an RBI and what did not constitute an RBI. It was not until 1931 that a definitive rule was put forth by Major League Baseball, and I'll read it here. Runs batted in are runs scored on safe hits, including home runs. That parenthetical, including home runs, is put there because some official scorers didn't think that a batter should get credit for batting himself in when hitting a home run, so they didn't do it. They tried to correct that with this rule. So it also includes sacrifice hits, outfield putouts, and infield putouts. And when the run is forced over by reason of the batsman becoming a base runner. So that happens when a batter with the bases loaded gets a walk or is hit by a pitch, he gets credit for a run batted in. Some scorers, official scorers, did not agree with that, or did not follow that beforehand, and actually chose not to follow it subsequently. And this is an important paragraph here. With less than 2 outs, if an error is made on a play, and I can't see that. A play on which a runner from third would ordinarily score, credit the batsman with a run batted in. And that particular part of the rule was not always followed even after it was a rule. Some scorers just said, oh, if it's an error, no RBI, and others did follow it. These rules these tenets are still in effect today. There's been some little changes in the wording and stuff, but they're basically, this is what we have. The only significant change occurred in 1939 when the rule was added. A provision was added that there's no RBI credit when a batter hits into a forced ground out double play. All right, with all these variances in the rules and the nonconformity of the official scores, it's not surprising that there'll be a lot of RBI errors in the official records. With regard to sources of RBI errors, there's 2 sources for an error in the official records, not just RBIs, but any statistic. The official scorer, he scores a game, he writes up a report, sends it to the league office or the official statistician. He can be plagued by math errors, such as counting up the RBIs for a particular player in his at-bats. 1 + 2 + 1 + 1 = 4. No, it equals 5. Those happen. Those errors happen. Transcription errors, they're most common, where the stat is added from player A and player B's stat cell, or the wrong column, for player A, putting an RBI in the run scored column. And then there are judgment errors. For instance, some scorer may just say, I'm not going to give credit to a batter when he walks with the bases loaded, give RBI credit to the batter. The official scorer puts everything together in a giant box score report that gets sent to the official statistician, and then he or she transfers that from the game account to a batter, a chronological listing spreadsheet for each individual batter. And so there's transcription there, and they can make math errors, such as adding up all the RBIs for a given month: 1 + 2 + 3 + 4 + 1 + 2 + 3 + 4 equals 19. No, it equals 20. We'll see an example of that in a little bit. And there are transcription errors. There's a number of these: wrong player, wrong column. All right. With that, let's go on to RBI errors. 1933, Detroit Tigers players. There were 14 games involving 11 players. Hank Greenberg was involved in 3 games with RBI errors with himself. The net effect of correcting those errors is -2. So in 1933, Hank Greenberg actually batted in 85 runs, not 87. 1934, there were 11 games involving 11 players on the Tigers. 4 of those players were future Hall of Famers: Gehringer, Goslin, Greenberg, and Cochran. For the 3 G-men, Gehringer, Goslin, and Greenberg, they ended up with the errors washed out because the pluses equal to minuses. And for instance, for Hank Greenberg, his official RBI total of 139 remains the same even after the errors at 139. 1935, there were 15 games with RBI errors involving 11 players. Hank Greenberg was involved in 2, and in each case he lost an RBI with the correction. He finished up with a total of 168 RBIs, not 170. 1936, there were 13 games with RBI errors involving 11 players. And even though Hank only played in 12 games in 1936 because of he suffered a broken wrist, he still was on the short end of correcting an RBI error. So instead of 16 RBIs in 1936, he ended up with 15. 1937, which Nathan mentioned before, was a big year for Hank. He had officially 183 RBIs. Doing the research, it turns out there was 1 RBI error that involved Hank, and he actually batted in 1 more run, which gives him a total of 184, which was a league leading total. 1938. There were 12 games with RBI errors, again, this time involving 12 players. Hank Greenberg was involved in one of those games, picked up 1 RBI, so he ended up with 147 instead of 146. In 1939, 8 games with RBI errors involving 8 players. Hank Greenberg was one of those players. The official records show 112. He actually had 113. And the reason he had 113 is because the official scorer decided that Hank did not deserve an RBI or merit RBI credit when he was hit by a pitch ball with the bases loaded. But he did, and he does. 1940, there were 5 games with RBI errors involving 6 players. Hank was not one of them, and so his AL leading RBI total of 150 remains as is. 1941, there were 2 RBI errors games. Hank was not involved in either of them. He played only 19 games in 1941 before he heeded Uncle Sam's call. And so therefore his RBI total remains the same at 12. He was in the service from 42 through 44. And in 1945, he rejoined the Tigers in midseason. He was not involved in any RBI error games, so his 60 RBIs remains the same. He played in only 78 games, so that's quite a number of RBIs for half a season, especially after coming back from the military. 1946, there were 5 games with RBI errors involving 6 players. Greenberg was not one of them, so his AL leading total of 127 remains the same. If you look at Pat Mullen's column there in the official records, it says 35, and then in brackets, it says 34, and in brackets, it says 35. That's because there's a math error. He actually, if you added up the RBIs he actually had, it's 34, but the officials' stats or the official records show 35. There was an RBI error where he picked up an RBI, so fortuitously the official record is correct, but in spite of the math error that they made. Okay, so that concludes Hank Greenberg's time with the Tigers. I won't go into his time with 1 year with Pittsburgh. Let's look at a summary of the RBI errors involving the Tigers. Altogether, in the 33 through 46 period, excluding the 42 through 44 war years, 100 games with RBI errors, 159 RBI errors, in those games, and involved 42 players. Players with 10 or more RBI errors are listed here: Gehringer, Owen, Gazin, Walker, Greenberg, and Rogel. Gehringer topped the list with 20, a net effect of +8. Greenberg had 11 RBI errors, net effect of -2. 4 of these players made up the Detroit Tigers infield from 1933 through 1937. Greenberg at first, Gehringer at the Keystone, Owen at the hot corner, and Rogel at shortstop. They achieved a pretty remarkable RBI record in those 4 years. They were dubbed the Battalion of Death in 1934, and in that season, the 4 of them combined to drive in 463 runs. That's a still standing record for an infield in the major leagues. The next year, they had 421, which ranks 6th among infields in Major League history. And if you look at 36 and 37, where they're not spectacular, if you take into account that Greenberg was injured after the 12th game in 1936, and Marv Olin was injured for more than a third of the season in 37, they would have easily surpassed the 400 RBI threshold. Looking at Hank's RBIs for his career with the Tigers, and this is based on my research, but it's also been approved and accepted by Pete Palmer and RetroSheet. He ended up with 1,200 RBIs for his career, not 1,202. So a little loss there. One thing that, if you look at this chart, you'll notice that Hank achieved his 1,200 RBIs in just 8 full seasons, plus a handful of games in 1936, 12, and 1941, 19, plus half a season in 1945. Well, that leads to an intriguing question. Which Major League player reached 1,000 RBIs the quickest? Well, we're going to answer that. We'll start off with 10th and 9th positions. They're occupied by Chuck Klein and Jim Bottomley, a couple of National League Hall of Famers from the 20s, 30s, and 40s. They each required more than 1,200 games to reach the 1,000 RBI mark. The number 8 slot is occupied by a modern player, Manny Ramirez, 1194. Number 7 is occupied by Double X, Jimmy Fox, 1160. He was a contemporary of Hank's. Number 6 is also by a relatively modern player, Juan Gonzalez, with 1158. Number 5, Ted Williams, a splendid splinter, 1147. Numbers 4 and 3 those rungs were taken by a pair of Yankees. Lou Gehrig with 1,079 games, and then Joe DiMaggio with 1,078. So now we're left with two more slots to fill in. We all know one of those slots is going to be filled by somebody because that's why we're here. The other one, you can think about it for a moment. Well, I'll tell you that he and Hank Greenberg were teammates in 1936. And well, the answer is the 2 players are Hank Greenberg and Al Simmons. Well, that now leads to who was the silver medalist and who took the gold medallion. Well, Al Simmons was first runner-up, which means that Hank Greenberg went away with the blue ribbon. He got 1,000 RBIs in just 1,027 games. That's a phenomenal achievement. In recognition of Hank's tremendous achievements on the baseball diamond, the Detroit Tigers erected a statue to stand at Comerica Park in 2000 for the opening of the ballpark. It shows Hank here connecting with the ball and driving the ball off his bat. Now on the base of the statue, the plinth, there's carved in stone are these two statements. Among statements, these two. Selected AL MVP in 1935 after leading the league with 39 homers and 170 RBIs. And the other statement that I'm bringing up here is drove in 183 runs in 1937, one short of Lou Gehrig's 1931 league record. Well, based on my research, and which has been approved by Palmer and Retrosheet, in 1935, Hank Greenberg actually had 168 RBIs, not 170 shown in the official records or carved in stone in the statue. And my research also showed that in 1937, Hank Greenberg drove in 184 runs, not 183 as shown in the official records, and carved in stone on his statue. So having 184 bona fide RBIs in 1937, does that mean that Hank Greenberg shares with Lou Gehrig the league record for most RBIs? Well, let's take a look at that. This chart compares Greenberg's 37 record and RBI record and Gehrig's RBI record in 31 on a month-by-month basis. And you can see that through the month of August, Gehrig, who played in every Yankees game, had 154 RBIs with 28 games left on the Yankees schedule, all in September. Greenberg, through August, had 144 RBIs, 10 less than Gehrig. He had also played in every game of the Tigers, and he had 35 games left, 32 in September and 3 in October. Let's see what happened. In Gehrig's 28 games, he batted in 31 runs, and he ends up with 185 RBIs. Greenberg batted in 40 runs, 32 in September and 8 in October to finish with 184. So it's 185 to 184. Now, most people know, that's in quotes, know that Gehrig batted in 184. And that's because that's what's in the official records. I've done the research on Lou Gehrig's RBI record in his first career, and I discovered that there are 6 errors in RBIs in the 1931 season. They're shown here. If you do the net effect, it's +1, -1, +1, -1, -1, +2 equals +1. So Gehrig did indeed have 185 RBI, not 184. This has also been accepted and approved by Pete Palmer and Retrosheet. It's there on those 2 websites, Baseball Reference websites and Retrosheet website. Let me go back and show a couple things what Hank Greenberg said about this. This is obviously before the corrections. Quote, "I was primarily concerned with and concentrated on driving in runs. I had always had my eyes on beating out Lou Gehrig's American League record. None of that happened. I lost to Lou Gehrig by 1 run batted in. To this day, I'm second in the league with 183, should be 184 runs batted in." One other thing that can be gleaned from this chart is that in September, Hank Greenberg played in only 31 of the 32 games the Tigers played. Hank did not play in the game in Washington, D.C. against the Senators on September 15th. He chose to observe the Jewish holiday Yom Kippur instead. Okay, let me wrap up my presentation by going back to what got me started in this research, and that is C. Grun and C. Grunby streaks. You can see here what the 2020 edition of the Elias Book of Baseball Records has for the Seed Run streak leaders. Red Rolfe and Kenny Lofton have the AL record and the Major League record with 18 gamers. Rogers Hornsby and Ted Kluszewski tie for the NL record with 17. Note that the record holders given in the Little Red Book of Baseball in 1961 are erroneous. For the Detroit Tigers, my research shows that Doc Kramer has the longest seed run streak by a Tigers player, a 16-gamer in 1944. Hank Greenberg is second with a 15-gamer in 1940. So at least for 4 years, Hank was the Tigers leader in consecutive games run scored streaks. Moving on to the seed run B streaks, RBIs, the current leaders, according to the Elias Book of Baseball Records, 17-gamer in the National League by Ray Grimes in 1922, and the 14-gamer by Trish Speaker of the Athletics in 1928. Again, the information given in the 1961 Little Red Book was erroneous. And before I give you my Tigers list, let me just mention about Trish Speaker. He has that record of 14 because in 1928, the official scorer, Trish Speaker hit a home run. The official scorer said no RBI for Trish Speaker. And so that interrupted the streak. When another SABR member, Trent McCotter, found the error, the streak, now it became a 14-game streak. Okay, now my Detroit Tigers, longest seed run streaks by seed run B streaks by Detroit Tigers players. The top streak, the longest streak is a 12-gamer, achieved twice by Mickey Cochran in 1934 and in 1940 by Rudy York. I'm surprised that Hank Greenberg did not have a higher streak. He had 9 is his longest streak, which is tied for 9th with several players. Okay, that concludes what I want to talk about my research. Before I go to any kind of questions or comments, let me present a table. Oh, I'm sorry, let me summarize. Concluding remarks. So I have achieved accurate RBI run scored numbers, and they're important for instance, Gehringer's 34 league leading total, Greenberg's 38 league leading total, and Greenberg's career total of 975, not 980. I also achieved accurate run batted in numbers, particularly Greenberg's 1935 and 37 AL leading totals, and his total as a career total with the Tigers, 1,200, not 1,202. I determined which Major League player reached 1,000 RBIs the quickest. It was Hank Greenberg, 1,027 games. I answered the questions that I posed 60 years ago. Doc Kramer has the longest seed run streak by the Tigers, 16-gamer in 44. And the longest seed run B streak by Tigers are the 12-gamers by Mickey Cochran in 34 and Rudy York in 1940. Okay, now let me go to my acknowledgements chart. These people helped me greatly in my research. I'm going to single out 5 people in particular: Steve Hurt, Pete Palmer, Tom Ruane, Seymour Seawolf, and Dave Smith. They were crucial, helped me in crucial situations many times. And I also wish to thank the Retro Sheet volunteers. They truly are enablers of baseball research. And with that, I'll stop and be happy to answer any questions or try to answer questions and take any comments.
Thanks, Herm, so much. It's fascinating material. If any of you have a question for Herm, go ahead and click raise hand. There's a button to do that. I want to note, so first of all, again, the significance. Hank's famous number in 1937 is actually 184. Lou Gehrig's is actually 185. They both take a back seat to the Cubs' Hack Wilson with 191 in 1930. So here's the interesting question for me. When you first found that the correct number was 184 and hadn't yet found that Lou's number was 185, it appeared that Hank had actually tied Lou Gehrig, the one record he chased and cherished. It looked like he had actually done it. And a question for you, or a question for any of you listening, as we have one participant, Sebastian, saying, well, every time we walk by that statue now at Comerica Park, we're gonna we're going to have to put at least a mental asterisk on it. I may go out there with a chisel and try to just change that 3 to a 4 based on what you found. I don't know if the Tigers would appreciate that. But if Hank had indeed tied Lou posthumously as of 2011, when you found this, what would the significance have been? I mentioned to you earlier, it's almost like if somebody vacates their gold medal years after the Olympics and you're the gold medalist, long after everyone's gone home and the medal ceremony has taken place. What would the significance really have been if we had discovered after the fact that Hank had indeed tied Lou? I'm interested in your thoughts, and anybody else listening, your thoughts on that.
Sure. If it were to appear in a baseball record book or an encyclopedia in boldface, that would be something. Elias has chosen not to accept this. I can argue with Elias on this. It would have been significant because it would be in a record book. It would show most RBI single season American League. It would show Lou Gehrig 1931, Hank Greenberg 1937. It would be there. It's, as it turns out, with the exception of the Elias Book of Baseball Records, there's no longer a baseball record book. I mean, it's in print. I mean, you can, if you go online, you want to look at most RBIs in a single season, you'll find Gehrig with 185, at least on Baseball Reference or Retro Sheet.
Anyone else with a comment or question? So what I was then thinking then is that it does seem almost kind of reassuring that Hank had the correct understanding that he was one short of Gehrig, even though he had the wrong numbers. He ended up having the right understanding of where he stood in relation to Gehrig. Lawrence has a question. I'm going to ask you to unmute and go ahead.
Yeah, I did have a question, and I don't think it's subject to answer, but Herm, try your hand at this. The players themselves, in this era, the players were already statistics conscious. So why wouldn't the individual player themselves have looked at the newspaper, the box score in the paper the next day, and noticed these obvious errors, and in their own self-interest or in the interest of baseball, said to the official scorer, "Here, there's a mistake here." Now, some of this isn't all related to the box score, because you've explained that it may have happened along the line later, but some of the stuff would have appeared in the box score as error that the players themselves should have noticed.
In this, for the particular game where Hank picked up the extra RBI in June 20th, 1937, second game of doubleheader, all the box scores show him with one RBI. They show him with the RBI. They show Rudy York with one RBI because he hit a solo home run. What happened is the 6 RBIs that the Tigers batters achieved, one each, including one by Greenberg and one by York, got bungled up in the official day-by-day records to show Greenberg with none, actually a blank cell, so they don't show a 0, they just show a blank cell, and Rudy York with 3. So the inputter, I mean, we make mistakes like that ourselves and with checkbooks and stuff like that. I mean, it can happen. My disappointment with Elias is that, in this particular case, is that it's crystal clear that Hank Greenberg did have an RBI and Rudy York had only one RBI, but they've chosen not to do that, to make that change. So,
yeah, it's a reminder how the statistical knowledge of players themselves in the earliest 20th century was limited. I'm mindful too of Ty Cobb's famous hit total was actually, I believe Pete Palmer found 4,189 and not 4,191. At the time, they had no idea. Nobody had a running hit total that season, as there was the famous batting race in 1910. Nobody really knew for sure what the official count was in the commissioner's office. Another question, your screen name is Marilyn Miller.
Yeah, yes, it is, but it's not. It's Dixie Taranjo from Boston. Herm.
Yeah, hi Dixie, good to see you.
I hope I can explain this question. On a couple of your charts, the charts have a minus for Hank, and yet there are 5 or 6 pluses for other players, but there are no other players there with minuses. How does that flush out?
I don't know which chart you're talking about.
I think it might be 1939, 1941. A couple of them had many more pluses than a single minus. And I was wondering how that evens out.
It's got it without seeing it and going through the specifics. I'm just going to say that the inputter from the Howe News Bureau, who were the official statisticians for the American League, just made a mistake. And so that it sometimes if they leave an RBI out, the player gets it, so he'll get a plus. There'll be nothing to balance it. There need not be a balancing with the RBIs.
Okay.
With one exception, in the run scored errors, they were all balanced. They were all just mistakes, or transcription mistakes, +1 or -1.
Okay. Thank you.
Hey, you're welcome. Good to see you.
Yep, same here.
Question from
doggies.
Mary Ian. Unmute and tell us where you're joining us from and your question.
So if C. Grun's streak was really on like every single record book or site that shows baseball statistics, how important and what of a stat would it be? How much would it be said? And also, how much would it actually describe how good that player is?
Hi, Patrick.
Hi.
Patrick is my grandson who's upstairs. I think it's for me, it's an interesting stat. I don't know that it's a major stat. It's not. It's certainly not going to have the interest or the clout of DiMaggio's 56 consecutive game hitting streak, but it is an interesting streak, and it does show consistency. But in the case of Hank Greenberg, with only a 9-game consecutive a nine gamer for a C. Grunby streak, that doesn't show how valuable he was as an RBI man. I mean, he knocked in 1,000 runs in 1,027 games. So it didn't pick it up, that streak. It's kind of a neat thing, but it's not that important. But a lot of neat things in baseball statistics that may not be important.
Our next question comes from one of our featured guests. Aviva Kempner is the filmmaker of The Life and Times of Hank Greenberg. We're delighted to have her join our panel at the top of the hour and delighted to have her with us right now. And she has a question for Herm. Welcome, Aviva.
Well, first, I'm from Washington, D.C., the battleground for America.
Indeed, yes.
No longer the battleground. Herman, my hat goes off to you. I wish I had known you when I was making the film. Now, I recall in recent years, a stat came up that the umpire wrote Hank a letter and said that in 38, I called, gave you a ball and not a strike, and then you hit a home run, and that may have impacted that he got 57 home runs. So you might want to look it up because we might have a further issue here. Because but I don't know, what his RBI was that year and etc. So I'd like to throw a curve to you. But I would like to comment on one thing. You're saying you're surprised that he may not have. Oh, good. Steve's there. Steve, do you remember what year? It was the 38 when the umpire wrote Hank and said, I called a ball instead of a strike, and then you hit a home run. What was that? There was someone who came to Hank years later. Do you remember what I'm talking about?
Yeah, but it wasn't a ball instead of a strike.
Yeah.
His 58th home run.
Right. I knew it was
in 1938 was an inside the park home run. It may have been the only inside the park home run he ever hit. It was really a triple. And
Exactly.
my dad said there was no way I was going to stop with 57 home runs with 5 games to go at third base. So he kept going. He was apparently out by about 15 feet at home plate, and the umpire called him safe. And years later, the catcher wrote my dad a letter and says, you know, you were really out. And my dad certainly acknowledged that that was the fact.
So Herman, Herman, you might want to look up then, your whole presentation today may be impacted by that. And just besides the great research you did, I want to comment on one line you said when you said you're surprised that his streaks didn't go longer. And it's a big point I'm going to make in the next hour is no one had the pressure than Hank did, and later on Jackie Robinson with the cat calling and everything. I would never be surprised if the streaks didn't continue because I just don't know how he did it every day. But
Sure.
That's my only comment on that.
Okay. Thank you. I enjoyed your film, and I saw it in San Diego at the SABR meeting in San Diego a couple of years ago. Very nice, very good.
And the one difference we might say with the Inside the Park home run is that it was officially called a home run, and there was no error in transcription or calculation or anything of that sort, as was the case with the errors that you found, Herm, right? And with no instant replay in 1938, that call stood.
Sure.
It was just a brilliant hook slide around the tag.
Yeah.
Great. We have a few other people with hands raised, and we're getting near the top of the hour. What I'd like you to do is enter your question into the chat window, and we might be able to take one more. Otherwise, I will just send your questions to Herm, and he can get back to you after the fact, because otherwise we're going to run out of time. We can take one more. Let's hear from Stan.
Yeah, first off, Herm, great job. And I know it was a lot of work to dig up all these interesting changes, I guess, in the official score. I was surprised at the number that you found. That's quite all-encompassing number. Were you surprised at the total number you found, and how much more is out there, do you think? Give me your thoughts on that.
There are a lot of errors, especially RBI errors during the 20s, 30s, and even in the 40s, even into the 50s. Well, because of the variance in the rules of the RBI rule itself, and the official scorers having their own opinions, at least for a decade or more, on what an RBI was. And the official statisticians, these are all, let's say, transcribed from the official statistician, the inputter at Howe Newsborough, did everything by hand, just everything by hand. So you see something and you write it, you transfer that number by hand to a spreadsheet, and errors are likely to happen. I mean, or not, it's not unlikely they'll happen. We're human beings, we're going to make mistakes. So.
Thanks again so much, Herm, for presenting your research, for all you've done. It's fascinating to hear what you found and to think about the significance. What strikes me is just, this is a story that's still unfolding. I mean, 2011, 100 years after the birth of Hank Greenberg, you found this significant research that made it into the biography of John Rosengren, who's just joined us as well. So the story is still being told, and there's still more to discover out there. And but thanks again for your time and for your presentation.
You're very welcome. And what do I do now? What do I do now?
So we'd love to have, we've stopped sharing your screen, and I assume you want to hear from everybody who's coming next. So now you can just take a virtual seat in the virtual crowd and enjoy the next portion.
And how do I do that?
You can just sit exactly where you are and just listen in.
I'll do that. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Nathan.
Yep. Thanks again, all of you, for joining us. We have a great turnout right now, 46 participants, and we think a few more are going to come on at the top of the hour here at 2 o'clock. So thanks, all of you. Again, I'm Nathan Bierma from SABR Detroit and TigersHistory.com. We did get a trivia winner for our question, and they win this 2019 Panini Diamond Kings card, a beautiful card, one of my favorites. It's not a vintage card, so it's not that valuable, but it's very nice. Stephen Weiner had the answer. Harry Eisenstadt was the winner of both games in the doubleheader on July 30, 1938. The significance being he was, I believe, the first Jewish pitcher of the Tigers. He appears in Life and Times of Hank Greenberg, recalling this story. And he was in the lineup of players for the final game at Tiger Stadium in 1999. So an integral part of Tigers history going back to 1938, and a triumphant moment for Jewish players and Jewish fans in that doubleheader. A reminder that at our web link, which I'll paste again, we have some bonus online items. An interview with Erwin Cohen, who was one of the facilitators of the number retirement ceremony for Hank Greenberg and Charlie Gehringer at Tiger Stadium in 1983. And I interviewed him about that, his memories and what it took to organize that ceremony, and his memories of interacting with Hank that day, some wonderful memories. And also my interview with Ron Kaplan, who is the author of Hank Greenberg in 1938, all about Hank Greenberg's home run chase, which of course happened just as Hitler was coming to power, and he intersperses those two things, and it's a fascinating narrative that way. And then also my photos from the Hank Greenberg Walk of Heroes, which was furnished by the Greenberg family, and it's at the corner ballpark at Michigan and Trumbull, the facility there on the site of Tiger Stadium. And we posted high-res versions of the photos so that you can read the installations of how Hank and some of the others are honored at that location. You can also follow links to donate if you would like to the Cheslaw Foundation, Aviva Kempner's production company, or to the Detroit PAL, which manages the Michigan and Trumbull site, or to SABR. And you're hearing from some of the people today who are so instrumental in SABR's research. What we want to do now, as we turn to our panel of distinguished guests to talk about the memory and legacy of Hank Greenberg, we want to view the trailer. I know many of you have seen this film. Maybe some of you, like me, rewatched it recently. But let's take a look at the trailer for Life and Times of Hank Greenberg to remind ourselves about that film, and to hear from Hank again. And I will attempt to share my screen and play that video now. Tell me if you can't hear the audio. I'm hoping this will work.
Growing up in the Bronx in the 30s and the early 40s, thought of nothing else but baseball and Hank Greenberg. Not the biblical Moses, but baseball Moses. I wanted to be Hank Greenberg, I suppose, and I couldn't be Hank Greenberg, so the word in Yiddish is knell. I just loved being part of a group that idolized Hank Greenberg.
When I was a kid, I always thought Hank Greenberg would be the first Jewish president. After all, he was the most successful Jew in America. He was good looking, he was tall, he was accomplished, he was well spoken. Why not?
6'4", as big as Schoolboy Rowe. My God, nobody ever saw a Jew that big.
Two-time winner of the American League's Most Valuable Player Award, Slugger Hank.
I can recall bigoted people in the stands yelling, "Hey, you kite, you're not supposed to be able to play ball." I found that it was the Spurs to make me do better.
There it is. And it's the guy going out the left. Looks like it's in the stands for a home run.
They recognized him everywhere. They said, "Hi, I went to school with you, Hank." I had met personally 4 million people in his high school at the same time. Hank, we went back, we all sat next to him, which was incredible. I guess they did it vertically.
He was the first professional ball player to enlist and go fight the Nazis. I thought he was fighting Hitler all by himself.
Call him the hero of heroes. Call him the champion of champions. I almost weep, still remembering what that meant to us.
So goodbye, Mr. Hank. Goodbye.
Sorry for the audio issue there. I did not properly enable audio sharing, but hopefully you could hear it at least toward the end. And again, you get the idea of what the film looked like and sounded like, the Life and Times of Hank Greenberg. Sort of an organizing motif for me today is this quote from John Rosengren's epilogue. A man does not expire with his last breath. He lives on in memories and the changes he wrought. Hank Greenberg is not dead. So long as his story is told, he remains with us. And that's kind of the organizing idea I have for our panel today, is how this memory, this legacy is alive, but how do we continue to celebrate and promote it? So let me introduce our guests. Steve Greenberg, son of Hank Greenberg, is a partner at Allen & Company, former deputy commissioner of Major League Baseball, co-founder of the Classic Sports Network, and former minor leaguer for the Washington Senators. We're also joined by Aviva Kempner, who also just spoke to us recently in the previous session, a filmmaker with numerous film credits and awards, recently The Spy Behind Home Plate, many others that are listed properly on the website, and I'll give you the link so you can look at those. And John Rosengren, his biography, Hank Greenberg, Hero of Heroes, in 2013. He's the author of numerous other books, including his brand new novel called A Clean Heart. Let me pose I want to ask each of you about your connection to Hank's story. In Steve's case, it's fairly straightforward. So Steve, let me ask you this. You were born shortly after your father's retirement from playing baseball. When and how did you start to gain a sense of how much he meant to baseball fans and to the Jewish community as a whole?
Well, nice to be with you, and John and Aviva, especially nice to be with the two of you. You know, I was born in 1948. My dad's last year playing was 1947, so I never saw him play other than in a couple of old timers games. As I recall, he popped up to the catcher one time and the shortstop the other time. So I never saw his prolific batting credentials as a kid. We grew up in Cleveland. My dad was general manager of the Indians in the 50s. Some excellent teams, as you baseball aficionados know. And I was an Indians fan, not a Tigers fan. My dad was the general manager of the hometown team, not the home run hitting star of the 30s and 40s in Detroit. So I really grew up thinking of him as the general manager of the Cleveland Indians. He was known in Cleveland in that capacity. So I knew he'd been a player and obviously understood that, but it really wasn't until we left Cleveland when I was 11, moved back to New York in 1959, and in those early teenage years that I began to understand the role that he had played and the status he had in the broader community. He was no longer associated with the hometown team, but people would stop him on the street and, you know, say hi, whether they knew him or not, and greet him. And you would have had to be oblivious to not understand that something was going on there beyond his being a general manager. So we didn't talk about it much in those years, but whether by osmosis or reading or otherwise, I figured out that he had been obviously a star player. In terms of his relationship with the Jewish community, it really was even after that, probably in my college years, in my 20s and beyond. And increasingly, funnily enough, over time, increasingly as the years went by and as the distance grew between his last days as a player and the present day, that it almost amplified the sense that here's a guy who hadn't played in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years as time went by, who was still remembered in bar mitzvah speeches by 13-year-old boys whose grandfathers had seen him play, rabbis who would stop me when I'd meet them and they knew my heritage, and just other people and how much Hank meant to them, not just as a ball player, but as a person in that period of time. So it really accumulated over time. There's no epiphany, no one moment, but it's come, I think, for all of our family. My daughter, who may or may not be on this call, Melanie, told me that she lives in Great Barrington, Massachusetts, that someone that she encountered there found out that she was the granddaughter of Hank Greenberg somehow and made a big deal out of it. So it's taken place over a long period of time, and it's not really ebbing. I think he, in Detroit, especially in the Detroit Jewish community, but really around the country, he continues to be a symbol of that we can all be proud of.
And I'm really curious to follow up on that, Steve. In the closing credits of Aviva's film, your older brother Glenn says, "For the longest time, I thought my middle name was son of a Hall of Famer, because I was always Glenn, son of a Hall of Famer Greenberg." And I suppose that people with famous relatives sometimes feel perhaps conflicted, like they can never, like they're always in their relative's shadow. How do you see it? Is your relation to your famous father a blessing and a burden, some of both, one or the other?
Well, I can only speak for me. I can't speak for my sister or my brother. My sister Alva may be on the call as well. I'm not sure. For me, as the middle child, I probably had an easier path than the oldest son, whose middle name was Hank. Glenn Hank Greenberg was my older brother's name. So he had a hard time escaping it or avoiding it. For me, I had a relationship with my dad that was always very easy, even though he wasn't always easy. He had a certain way that things had to be done, and had certain standards that one had to live up to, especially if you were his kid. But it never troubled me. So I can only say I never really felt the pressure, if you will, of being Hank Greenberg's son. I was either intelligent enough or realistic enough very early on to realize that I was not going to be a Hall of Famer. I did play pro ball and played in the minor leagues, but I had no illusions about where I was going as a baseball player, which was not to Cooperstown. So it never troubled me. The only time I really felt pressure was when he actually came to watch me play in person. And I think he knew that. He would come once a year, wherever I was playing, and watch a game. And that was really the only time I got really nervous. And maybe every kid whose dad comes to watch him play feels that way. You don't have to be the son of a Hall of Famer. So for me, it was never a burden and almost always beneficial.
Thanks for sharing those reflections. Let me turn to Aviva. And I heard your interview recently with Rob Nyer on the SABR podcast. And you said that the night that you heard that Hank Greenberg died in 1986, that you knew you had to tell this story. And this launched a over 10-year journey to making this film. What was it about that news that night that led you to make this film?
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for organizing this. And I just want to apologize because I was from Detroit. I do have the Nats red on because I've been here since '73. I hope you appreciate that. Although my American League team, might be the Tigers with a little bit of Boston. I also think that we should say that today is in honor of Tommy Lasorda, because he was another very interesting, important, colorful figure in baseball. Well, actually, it was the morning after. It was September 5th, 1986, and I'm getting dressed. And I was in Los Angeles, interesting enough, and I'm getting dressed to open up my first film called Partisans of Vilna, about Jews fighting Nazis. And I said, oh my gosh, I just started crying, because growing up in Detroit, my father had been an immigrant Jew who had gone in the army. He had faced anti-Semitism in the army. After the war, he had moved with my mother, who was a survivor. I was born in Berlin, to Detroit, and he loved baseball, as many immigrants did. And he brought my brother up and I to love baseball. But the ritual was every Yom Kippur, he would take my brother and I to services. And later on, my parents were divorced, so we were with him. And I would always hear the story about how Hank Greenberg had played in '34. The opening night of Yom Kippur, it's called Kol Nidra. I thought Hank Greenberg was part of Kol Nidra's services. So the minute I heard, I said, okay, I got to go make this film. And actually, I call it my bat mitzvah film. It took 13 years, but Steve and the family were a big reason why I was able to pull it off. But that's only part of the reason. By then I had had this real revelation about what the Holocaust meant in our family. We hadn't talked about it. My dad had talked about anti-Semitism, but every time we went by the Shrine of the Little Flower, my dad would point his finger and say, that anti-Semite. As a matter of fact, I've been thinking of Coughlin a lot lately, not for good reasons in terms of America. But in any event, it was just also this thought I had about, it was just incredible what he had faced. And it's the stories my dad had told me. And, you know, the more I read, what was really a good timing is that Ira Berkow had just finished the book, Hank's autobiography that Ira Berkow had edited. It was just coming out. As a matter of fact, I remember going to see Steve, and Steve said, well, I don't want the film to come out before the book. And I said, well, I don't think that's going to be a problem. So in other words, it did come out. But I think it also has to do very much with a theory I have of we in the Jewish community, especially in America, that a lot of our heroes are underknown. And what was interesting about Hank, I mean, as funny as Woody Allen can be, he has sort of this nerdy, nebbishy Jewish male. I grew up with this gorgeous, striking Hank Greenberg as, you know, the image in the home. And I wanted to portray that. And that's why very much, you know, I also have the female fans because I have some of that. For me, it was Mark McGuire and Rafi Palmero. We won't talk about how they both got in trouble. But, and then the other thing is that I love the film Diner. And Diner is so much about fans loving players. And Hank evokes some of the most delightful stories. You see Walter Matthau talking, you see the Levin brothers who in Washington, I knew them for political reasons. There's something about, especially a sports hero, that makes, you know, men feel like boys and also women feel like, you know, whatever. I mean, you know, both respects. And I'll never forget when there was an opening of the film in the suburbs of New York, and a man came out crying, saying, this is the second time I've seen the movie. So I decided at that time, I don't know if I still believe this, that on my grave, it should say, she made men cry. And I think, you know, Diner is just one of these fabulous films about how sports can just consume your life. And I think everyone remembers, you know, the people they idolize when they're young. And that's what I was hoping to capture, because I think you really deserved it.
Wonderful. I want to ask you too, the film includes what appears to be clips from 2 different interviews with Hank. And I know you've said that one of the biggest labors of the task was trying to get the rights to some of the archival footage. But I was curious, who filmed those interviews? What were they from, and how were you able to get them?
Well, one was the interview with Dick Schaap. Okay. And not only was Dick great in the film himself, but he made sure that ABC didn't charge me for it. And then, Steve, do you remember, oh God, I didn't get a lot of sleep last night. Who was the other interview that Hank gave?
Roy Firestone.
You're right. So that's not so much what costs money. And now I'm trying to figure out how to get the film streamed. It's actually the music that's the most expensive, because it was wonderful swing music there, and I wanted to use the original stuff. And MLB is very good about, you know, using the footage. It has to do so much with the fact that you want to recreate the times, and you go for documentary footage, and a lot of it, you know, is more available now. You know, the other reason I really wanted to make this film is I grew up in Detroit, and it was really my love story to Detroit. And I always say this is the most positive film about Detroit. Of course, it's about the 30s and 40s, but Detroit is coming back. So, and actually Arn Tellem, who you just now see in the trailer, who has this wonderful story that when he got married, he had a Hank Greenberg card in his jacket. And actually he wound up working in the law firm with Steve, and they're good friends. He's with the Pistons now, right?
Yeah. No, he's the king of Detroit is what.
Oh, king of Detroit. Okay.
That's, if you ask Arn, that's what he is.
Okay, I'll give it to him.
Yes, he's the vice chairman of the Pistons.
Right.
All right, John Rosengren, thanks for joining us, and tell us, your biography came out in 2013. Tell us about the background of it. How did you know that you wanted to tell this story?
Well, hello, Nathan, and thanks, as others have said, for organizing this. Appreciate it, and thanks for the invitation to be part of it. Steve and Aviva, nice to see you and be able to share the stage with you virtually today. I remember the day I was driving in my car and a story came on, All Things Considered, that talked about Aviva's film. And I grew up a baseball fan. I grew up in Minneapolis, so I grew up a Twins fan. The Tigers were not my favorite team, I'll admit. But I heard this story about Hank Greenberg, and I knew, history of the game, but I'd never understood the place that Hank Greenberg occupied in terms of cultural significance in America. And as I was listening to this story on NPR over the radio, it became clear to me just how important he was. And I remember pulling into the parking lot of a shopping mall where I was going to make a stop, and I stayed in the car to listen to the end of the story because I was so taken by what I was learning about Hank Greenberg. So from there, I wrote an article about his 1945 season-ending pennant-clinching home run in St. Louis. And as I was researching that, I thought, there's really a lot to this guy's life story. And, not only was he a great ball player, but he, as I said, held this place of such significant cultural importance in American history. And also, as Aviva says, he's so underknown. Someone like me, a big baseball fan, really hadn't known his story or his importance or his place in the game and in American history. So I thought there's enough for a book here. And at the time, Ira Berkow's book was out, but there was not really a definitive biography. And much as I liked hearing Hank's words in the book Ira had edited, I thought there was more to his story that could be explored and told. And so that, set me on the course of writing this book. And I was amazed by, I am not Jewish. And so I learned a tremendous amount of history about anti-Semitism, not just in Europe, of course, but in the United States. And, I was dismayed that I wasn't taught this stuff in school and that it wasn't talked about more. And the community next door to mine, Edina, Minnesota, is a restricted community, and I hadn't known that. And so they're just it was an enlightening and an awakening for me. And I thought that was really important too. And so as I was promoting the book, I thought as important it is for me to speak to Jewish audiences, it's also important for me to speak to non-Jewish audiences to help educate people about what this means. And probably my closest friends and neighbors got tired of hearing me talk about it, but I was on this sort of crusade to enlighten those of us who hadn't known this before. And then I must say, though, that in spite of all I learned about Hank's role and his importance to the Jewish community and how he bore this mantle of being the Jewish representative, really an ambassador during the 30s and into the 40s, it became more personal for me when I was out on the road speaking to JCCs and libraries and synagogues where I really came to understand the importance that Hank had in other people's lives, in fans' lives. I mean, these older guys primarily would come up to me, guys that were old enough to have known or watched Hank or listened to him on the radio, during his career, and they'd show me a baseball that he had signed, or they'd have a jersey on, number 5, or they'd have a framed print they wanted to show me. And it was this, again, a deeper understanding on my part of just how important Hank Greenberg was to these people's lives. And Aviva, you talk about having lived it, but for me, again, that was the awakening of understanding what he really meant to these people, because I grew up with heroes and was a fan, and most of us grew up with heroes and fans, or are fans of players. But Hank, I think, is on the equivalent with Jackie Robinson in terms of what he meant to people and how much their hopes and dreams rode on his shoulders, and the way his success helped lift people and their spirits. And I really didn't understand that till these people were talking to me and showing me the artifacts of their lives and what he meant to them, that it really sunk in.
It strikes me too that we saw in the trailer Walter Matthau, and he died, I believe, last summer or the year before. And around the same time, Carl Reiner, and a clip surfaced soon after of him talking about his memories of growing up and what it meant to follow what had Hank Greenberg done that day. And it struck me that we are at this point where we are losing people who have those firsthand memories of Hank's playing days. And so the importance of telling the story and passing it along and generating new interest in it, as you said, and as you've done, is paramount. Let me ask each of you, it comes across in the film and in the biography that Hank Greenberg certainly didn't set out to become a transcendent superstar. He just wanted to be a ball player. He just wanted to be a great hitter. Let me ask each of you, starting with Steve, over time in his career, that changed. He came to accept and appreciate the larger importance he had taken on. What's your perspective on how and when that happened?
Well, I think there was a seminal event, I think, in his life, in the life of a lot of other people, called World War II. I think when he went off to the service, and he was in the service for 4.5 years, part of the story of my dad's life that's well known, was drafted initially, discharged a week before Pearl Harbor, and then re-enlisted and was in, missing all of the, or virtually all of the 41 season, 42, 3, 4, and came back in July of 45. A couple of things. First of all, people ask me all the time, does he regret that he missed all those years in the service? And I can honestly tell you, not only did I never hear him once complain or gripe about it or say, gee, I would have had 500 home runs if I hadn't missed those years. Quite the opposite. He viewed that service as really one of the most important things he had done in his life. But I also think it changed his worldview in many ways. And obviously it made him think, as it did others, about the Jewish community in a way that perhaps he hadn't before. So that was a big moment or period in his life. As time went on, and as I said, in my observing him through my teens and 20s and 30s, it became more and more apparent that people who were coming up to him to say hello or tell him how much he meant weren't doing it the way they would with Joe DiMaggio or Mickey Mantle saying, gee, you were a great hitter. Gee, I remember that catch you made. They were doing it because they related to him his Jewishness. And I think that he was a cerebral man. That really made him think more and more about what his true role was, which was not the guy who had 58 home runs so much as it was the man, not because he intended to, but who sort of unwittingly became this symbol for his people. So I saw that more and more, and you couldn't help but see it when you read his fan mail, because he would get letters asking for autographs, or letters just saying what he meant to them, or rabbis sending bar mitzvah speeches that kids in the synagogue had written. So he couldn't help but come to grips with that, and it meant a lot to him over time, and increasingly the older he got.
Aviva, do you agree that the war was sort of the what led to that sort of shift, or how do you see that shift over time?
Well, let me go back to 34. I mean, can you imagine in the city, every day they're writing stories. Will he play on Rosh Hashanah? We're talking about a pennant race. We're talking about his home runs being crucial. And then, you have this whole story about they're asking different rabbis, can he go, can't he go? And they say, if they don't sell anything, I mean, some of the stories are wild. And then of course he's told by one rabbi, you can, because the kids were playing, but as Dick Schaap says, has the best line, one of the best lines in the film, but they were talking about the Roman kids, right? And then they have a headline in Hebrew. If someone can tell me, I have yet to find out how they got that headline. It's just amazing to me that they had it. But I think Hank says it the best. He says, I didn't think I was a hero until that day I walked in and everyone stood up.
Into the synagogue.
Yeah, in the synagogue. And I think that really means a lot. And even back to Rosh Hashanah, when his good friend is saying how the cantor would keep on asking, what's happening? Now, in today's world, people can put their iPhones in the tallis in their prayer bags. Or I remember my dad would always watch baseball or listen to baseball with a transistor radio. But back then, the kids were running to the car and listening to it in the car. I mean, it really was a phenomena. But I think there are two things. I think it was incredibly, Hank did not have to go. He could have gotten out because of the bad feet, although there was a lot of social pressure in the press. And, I defer to Steve in terms of what Hank said later, because I never had the benefit, but I have all these, the interviews we have on tape. But I think another reason that Hank is such a hero is how he stood up for Jackie Robinson, that because he was unfairly traded that last year, we have that encounter. And I have the rabbi saying it, that I'm so glad. And, a lot of us, I've done a film about Black-Jewish relations in Rosenwald, a lot of what I'm feeling about the two new senators from Georgia. But I think right up there with the Black-Jewish story is Hank's story with Jackie and greeting him. And people mention that. I will have to say that I'm going to bring up another incident too, that if maybe I had to do it again, because I also fall into my dad and those fans' adoration for Hank. There is a story, and I have it on, I have the DVD, has bonus features of Hank Greenberg, and you can still order it on the website, that in 35, the World Series was during Yom Kippur, and Hank intended to play. But the great story is that God intervened and he broke his wrist. So he wound up not playing. So, and his brother talks about it, to me about that. But I think in the end, again, I have only his taped interviews saying that, he's very glad he went. The big thing for me about those 4.5 years, and I'm researching it with my one of my fellow coworkers, is I think it's fabulous what they've just done for the Negro Leagues and incorporating the stats. But I feel very strongly, and I just brought that up with people at Cooperstown, that for Hank, for DiMaggio, for Willie Mays, for Ted Williams, for Bob Feller, there should be asterisks in saying these men served in World War II. And their stats would be a lot more. And there was recently a Jewish player, a slugger, I can't remember his name off my top of my head, but I'm sure half the audience knows. He just broke Hank's record for career home runs. And I meant to write the essay then, but I'll get to soon. And they said, well, he had more home runs than any Jewish player. And I thought, yeah, except he didn't go off to war for 4.5 years. So I rest my case.
Right. John, on this question of Hank's own developing awareness of his significance as a transcendent cultural figure, you open your book with that image of Hank sitting in the clubhouse agonizing over whether or not to play on Rosh Hashanah 1934. And as I recall, you talk about him being conflicted. First of all, he felt this sense of devotion to his parents, who were very religiously observant. But also, even then, he had this awareness of what he and what his decision about whether or not to play meant to the Jewish community. Is that right?
Exactly. I think that was the seminal moment in his awakening. And he had this, it was a gradual awakening. And, most of us, as we age, mature, we come to a deeper understanding of our place in the world and what it means. And he held, a larger place of significance than many of us, but he, I think, came to this awareness over time. And as Steve mentioned, World War II was definitely a formative time for him, and he was older and so more reflective, and it really affected his worldview as I understood it. But I think it growing up in a Jewish neighborhood in the Bronx, it was just kind of a given. He was Jewish. I don't think he thought about that as much, what it meant to be a Jew. It's sort of like, the two fish, one asking, "Hey, how's the water?" And the other says, "What's water?" I mean, it wasn't until he left home that he really started to identify as a Jew, because it was vis-a-vis non-Jews. And then it was being in 34, as has been said, he just wanted to be a ball player and a great ball player, and he was. And he had a good season in 34. Was one of the key members of that team, which was a very good team, as you remember, with guys like Mickey Cochran and et cetera. But he started attracting all this attention as Rosh Hashanah neared, and it was a subject of debate. And he had this conflict between his growing up, and I think he was much more observant growing up than he was later in his life, obviously. And so sometimes we lose sight of it, but it was important to be home for dinner on Friday night, and for him for Shabbat, and for him to be honor his commitment to his parents. And so he promised them he wasn't going to play. And then he felt the pressure from the owner, Navin, from his manager, and from his teammates. And yes, they were in a pennant race. And it was also enormously important to Detroit at the time. Remember, this is 1934 in the Motor City, when the Depression has just decimated employment, and people are, suffering. And so baseball and the Tigers' success become a diversion, something they can feel good about and give them some sense of civic pride as well. So he felt the weight of his city, his team, and on him on one side, and then the weight of his parents and personal commitment to them, and his Jewish identity as well. And imagine, the guy was 23 years old. This is a difficult decision to grapple with at that time. And I thought he bore it with quite a bit of grace. He certainly deliberated very carefully and conscientiously about the decision. And as Aviva mentioned too, he got conflicting advice both ways. But finally, I think it was when he was sitting in that clubhouse with his teammates looking around. He'd gone to services in the morning, and then he was sitting in the clubhouse, and he thought, these guys, I've been with them this season, and they were family, basically. I owe it to them. I can't let them down. And that prevailed, that sentiment. And so then he played, of course, and worried that he had incurred the wrath of all sorts of people. And he famously hit 2 home runs, or accounted for the 2 runs. And that was provide the margin of victory for his team in an important game. And he worried what to do then the next day. But I think too, he struck a balance there between being faithful to his faith and identity, and also to being loyal to his teammates and his vocation. So quite a profound act, I think, at that moment in his life. And as he went on, I think in 38, when he was chasing Babe Ruth's single season home run mark, he became aware of the anti-Semitism against him. He'd certainly been aware of it prior to that within his team and in other teams, and in Detroit, of course, with Coughlin and Ford, and also elsewhere. But it was, again, I think, became more personal for him, and crystallized again in his mind the significance of his role in as a Jewish ball player. And then the war, I think it became even more as he traveled outside the United States and saw what was happening, and of course saw what Hitler was doing in Europe. It became just so much more important to him and his identity. That's a long answer to a his progression, as I understand it.
Can I just add a couple other things? I mean, what John says is really good, but when you think about it, Detroit was the most overtly anti-Semitic city because of Coughlin. I mean, in the late 30s, the things he was saying on the radio, you know, were similar things that a certain person that will be gone in 10 days has also been saying. And second of all, Ford, they were distributing the Protocols of Zion at, you know, Ford dealerships. Although ironically, I have a picture in the film where both of them are at the game. And I cannot tell you what, I can't get over the fact, and maybe Steve can add what if his father ever talked about it. Not only did he get catcalling from opposing players or in cities, but, you know, also from the stadium. I just can't imagine what that would mean. And it's interesting because I did the film on Mo Berg, who played in similar years, although he was not the home run hitter. I couldn't find any evidence of that. Of course, he risked his life trying to find out if the Nazis had a bomb, you know, nuclear bomb. The other thing is, this is also a time where Jews themselves were changing names. There was housing covenants. I live in a neighborhood now in Washington that I couldn't have bought this home in the 30s. And people weren't getting into school that were Jewish. So it was really a big thing. And at one point, Steve, I have you saying in the film, I mean, you said to me that Hank said that it came to a point where he felt like every home run was against Hitler. Another one of my favorite lines. And, you know, when you talk about the influence of people later, I had the honor of interviewing Ruth Bader Ginsburg for my Molly Goldberg film, Gertrude Berg, but she also said something that I used in the bonus features of Goldberg, but just recently I wrote it all out for a book on women in baseball. She said that because she knew the story of Hank Greenberg, they decided that they'll never have lawyers have to present cases on Yom Kippur because it would create a conflict if it was a Jewish lawyer. And she says her whole role model was Hank Greenberg. So, you know, it's sort of nice to have an RBG and a Hank Greenberg story. And it seems like I do a lot of Bergs, which I seem to do, but I love to be able to have that story.
Well,
Yeah, that's called the Greenberg rule.
Aviva, since this is a baseball group, I'll have to repeat what my dad told me about Mo Berg, and it had nothing to do with his heroism. The rap on Mo Berg at the time, who, as you probably know, was Princeton educated, obviously very smart guy. The rap on him around the league was he could speak 6 languages, but he couldn't hit in any of them.
Right. But actually, before he got injured, he wasn't so bad in the beginning. And it was I had someone else.
Aviva, you're talking to a group of baseball statisticians. Don't try to pretend that Mo Berg could hit.
Okay.
We'll have to revisit Mo Berg on another day, perhaps. Let me ask each of you a last question from me, and then we'll turn it over to Q&A questions from our audience. Aviva and John, you've both said today, and you've said in your work, that Hank is under-remembered, underappreciated. His story is, I believe John's words were, underknown. That's certainly true for me. I grew up here in Michigan as a Tigers fan. Everybody's most revered player was Al Kaline, and for the most part for good reason. But this story I only relatively recently discovered through the film, through John's book. And now I'm just blown away by it. As you mentioned, in the context of the 1930s, this is just one of the most remarkable personal stories, certainly in Detroit Tigers history and in baseball history as a whole. So is it true that Hank's memory is both larger than life and yet that he is underknown? And how can we celebrate and promote this story, especially as we mentioned, to future generations and future fans? Steve, can I start with you?
Yeah, and I guess I would just, as a lawyer, say your assumption assumes facts, not necessarily an evidence. I actually think for someone who hasn't put on a uniform in 75 years, my dad is incredibly well remembered compared to many of the great Hall of Famers of the 30s and 40s, in part because of the Jewish, in large part because of the Jewish community. And in terms of being recognized by folks like SABR, who live in the world of baseball statistics, I looked it up the other day, and I forget exactly what it was, but I sort of Googled greatest baseball sluggers of all time or hitters of all time, and found 3 or 4 different credible organizations that ranked them. And one had him ranked as the 4th greatest slugger of all time, behind, I think, Babe Ruth, Barry Bonds, and maybe it was Mark McGwire, but ahead of Mantle and Williams and DiMaggio and a bunch of others. And he's, always in the top 20, I'll say, of, greatest hitters, all-around hitters in every ranking. So I actually think both in terms of the community at large, especially the Jewish community, he's incredibly well remembered for, 3/4 of a century later, and certainly by those who study baseball stats and the history of the game, especially since when you look at 331 home runs, it's easy to dismiss that and say, well, gee, that wouldn't be close to a Hall of Fame career today, but people recognize he was 11 full seasons or whatever it was. And if you look at his RBIs and that stretch of 5 or 6 years before he went into the service, there aren't many who've ever replicated that. So I'm not sure I agree with the premise.
I certainly don't want to disagree with you, but let me put it to the Aviva and John. What do you think?
Well,
I think that he certainly, it's unfortunate he's under-remembered, and that it's, I agree with Steve that yes, he enjoys a degree of celebrity and name recognition and appreciation among the Jewish community, but I think he's not as well remembered as, say, a Lou Gehrig, or if he played in a New York, I think, we'd certainly have would have enjoyed a larger profile as a player, and certainly now still today. But I think that, Hank was a great hitter in not just that he had power, but for the ability to drive in runs, which he considered the most important thing, and as Herm done. And I'm very grateful to Herm for his research, by the way, into Hank and helping bolster Hank's legacy. But he also was a clutch hitter. And that's what made him, one of the, I think, critical to his greatness was when you needed a hit, you wanted Hank Greenberg at the plate, or if you needed a run driven in, and he figured that was the way that he could contribute most to his team. And I as I was doing my research, that probably is the most key statistic in terms of a player's worth to his team at the plate is how many runs he can generate. And so anyway, that Hank did it, obviously prolifically. And so that's a key factor. And so how to continue to keep his memory alive and even to perhaps raise his platform today, I think it's by doing things like this. So again, I thank you for hosting this sort of platform. And it's also of continuing to tell his story. Every chance I get, I welcome to be able to talk about him and what he contributed to the game, to our country, and to be able to continue to tell that story. I mean, that's how we honor our elders and our ancestors. And it's also how we keep alive the memories of those who are important in the history of our nation, of our people.
Well, John, let me just say, I couldn't agree with you more. I think I'm not suggesting we not do what we can to keep the story alive and that we do things like this. It's why I do things like this. Right. But all I'm saying is we live in a society that has a memory of about 5 minutes on most things. More appalling or shocking to me is the number of ball players and even African-American ball players who don't understand who Jackie Robinson was. So I'm just saying in the context of our society at large, I think it's amazing that that kids are writing bar mitzvah speeches about Hank Greenberg in 2021 when he didn't play. He hasn't played since 1947. But I think these forums are certainly important, and I'm all for them.
Yeah. Well, to your point, I'd say we're doing our job, right? Then we're kids are still writing those bar mitzvah speeches.
Yeah, I want to make a shout out to the group of men, I think they're all men, who've put together the Hank Greenberg annual golf tournament in the suburbs of Detroit. First of all, I could only raise a certain amount of money every year to shoot. I got all my great interviews there. So I really appreciate what they put together. That's one thing. Certainly at Tiger Stadium, they have a statue of Hank, and that's great. We in the new Nats Stadium, we had some like paintings of different players, and for a while Hank was there. It's no longer there, but you know, it's a matter. And Cooperstown certainly has a nice tribute to him, and that's great. But I'll tell you what's going to make a big difference. As soon as I can get all the rights paid, the Life and Times of Hank Greenberg is going to stream. And if anyone who knows me, I'm going to get it all over, especially through SABR, because it's really important. There's like 2 generations that haven't seen the film. And I always say that that's one reason I'm in filmmaking, but it's really the power of film, but also John's book really helps. And maybe you can issue it again on, what do you call it, in paperback. And I think that's also important. Now, interestingly enough, another controversy or resolution to a controversy is also bringing up Hank's name. Another thing I'm going to write about, because my newest film, if you had asked me at 20 that I was going to make now a 3rd sports film, I would have laughed in your face. But they're never just sports films. I'm co-directing a film and producing a film called Imagining the Indian, about the use of the fight against Native American mascoting. And you see the lovely conclusion. I really give a lot of credit to the Cleveland baseball people for really listening to the community and changing the name. I mean, first they went with the symbol and that, but you have to remember that Hank and Bill Veck, were owners at one time. So actually I have a question for you, Steve. What do you think Hank would say if he was around today about this change of the name, or would he have any commentary on it?
Well, I won't answer that hypothetical question, but since you mentioned my dad and Bill Veck,
right.
My dad became aware of the issue you're referring to, Aviva, in the early 1950s when he was partners with Bill Veck. And they owned the Indians together. Bill was the principal owner. My dad was a general manager and owned a smaller piece. My dad went to the ballpark one day, and Veck walked into his office and said, "Hank, I'm really worried about the Indians." And my dad said, what do you mean? We're 4 games in first place. He says, no, not the Cleveland Indians. And then he went on to say he'd been reading about the treatment of the Native Americans, American Indians, historically, and raised that issue in the early 1950s with my dad. But I don't know how he would feel about it. That would be speculation on my part.
Well, I think you just earned yourself another speaking part in my upcoming documentary, because that's exactly what I wanted to know, if they had a concern of it. And also, in a minute, I would love to have done a film on Bill Veck, but that's another story. Yeah, I think that I would like to even see more, either art or statues or reissuing old baseball cards, not just Hank, but the more we can retell the story, because I have to say, and I know I'm going to get a lot of blowback, I still would like to see the American League, the National League, and there's one winner. I'm a little, no one benefited more from the new system than my Nats, but it's sort of interesting to me that I want, and then the daytime games and the wool uniforms, I really want the young people to know what it used to be and what it used to be a baseball player. And the money Hank was the first $100,000 player. What are they making that a second now? So I think it's really interesting for people to know history. And that's why I think SABR is so important in Cooperstown. And writers like John and relatives like Steve that will talk about it, because I really think you can't understand where we've come to without understanding our history.
Well, Aviva, since you mentioned statues in Tiger Stadium, if I may, I'll tell one quick story.
Sure.
Mike Ilitch, who I got to know when I was a deputy baseball commissioner, the late Mike Ilitch, owner of the Tigers, who was a great guy, was a terrific person to me, told me a story. He had aspired to be a professional baseball player, was a young minor leaguer actually in the Tiger system as a 17 or 18-year-old. And it must have been had to be either 1945 or 46. He was in the minor leagues and broke his leg or his ankle and was back in Detroit to see the doctor. And the management said, come on out to Tiger Stadium and watch the game. So he came out hobbling on his crutches, a 17 or 18-year-old kid. And they said, go down in the locker room. You can, meet some of the players. So he went in the locker room during batting practice. And he said, a bunch of the players were milling around, and my dad was sitting there, back from the war, future Hall of Famer, great star of the team. And none of the players would talk to him, but my dad said, hey kid, come over here. So Mike hobbled over, and my dad said, what happened to your leg? And he told the story. He'd been playing in the minor leagues and had broken his leg. And my dad said, well, come on, I'm going up to take batting practice. Come on up, sit on the bench during batting practice. And Mike told me the story many, many years later, and you could see the gleam in his eye. And he said there was no way I was going to build a stadium that didn't have a statue of your dad in it.
Well, can I just follow up with my Mike Ilitch story? Because when I was researching my book, which is in paperback, by the way, Aviva, anyways, I went to the archives that the Tigers have, and they're in Ilitch's offices, which are in the Little Caesars building. So you walk in the building, in the lobby by the elevators are these bronze statues of the Little Caesar. And so I go upstairs, the 6th floor, whatever it was, and I'm doing my research. And the woman there, I wish I could remember her name, but she was very helpful and accommodating. But one of the things that struck me was on the wall was a piece of a drooping pizza slice, and it was Mike Ilitch's homage to Tom Monahan, the founder of Domino's. Like his little private inside joke there.
Well, so earlier the question came up about Hank's time in the front office in Cleveland, and that relates to one of the first questions that's been posted. And I invite all of you, if you have a question, either type it into the chat window or click the raise hand button, and I can call on you to ask your question to our panel. But one question that was posed here is, can any of the panelists speak about the importance of Hank's role as GM in Cleveland in the integration of Black players into Major League Baseball?
Well, I would be remiss if I didn't say that Bill Veeck and my dad were a team. And Bill Veeck, you heard earlier his concern about the plight of the American Indian, the Native Americans. He was equally outraged at how Black players had been treated. So the two of them really worked in tandem. I don't know, obviously Jackie Robinson signed with the Dodgers, and Branch Rickey deserves all the credit for that. But in the late 40s, early 50s, I'm not sure there are any organizations that signed more Black players than the Cleveland Indians. One of my dad's favorite roles with the Indians was really working with the young players. And I can remember as a kid, 5, 6, 7 years old, going down to Daytona Beach for spring training, where they had 4 fields back to back with a big tower in the middle. And my dad would stand in the tower and watch the players. And out of that collection came the likes of Jim Mudcat Grant and many, many great African-American ball players. And for my dad, it was a combination of things. It was one, social justice, which he clearly believed in, hence his support for Curt Flood, his support of Jackie Robinson when Jackie broke in 1947. But also it was pragmatism. He said, these guys were great players. So why wouldn't you sign as many great players as you could, irrespective of what color they were? So I think Veeck and my dad certainly played a role in promoting, if you will, many black players in the early days of integration.
And I met Larry Doby, and he just affirmed what Steve said. I mean, he really was very effusive about the fact that I believe Larry Doby was the first African-American signed in the American League, right? And
Right.
that's because he played for Cleveland. He was signed for Cleveland.
Well, and speaking of that, I guess the other story I would tell is when my dad was general manager, Lou Boudreau was the player manager. And in the late 40s, 48, actually, they won the World Series. And my dad had seen Satchel Paige pitch in his barnstorming days before integration. When my dad was in the big leagues, they used to have barnstorming tours after the season, and they'd play against some of the Negro League All-Stars. And who knows how old Satchel was at the time, certainly well in his 40s. And my dad wanted to bring him in for a tryout. And Lou Boudreau, the player manager, was opposed to the idea. Thought he had a good pitching staff. Why bring in this older guy, leaving aside whether there was any prejudice attached to it. So my dad finally convinced, well, let's have him come in and just work out with us and throw. So Paige came out, got on the mound, was warming up. And my dad said, Lou, why don't you go in and take a few swings against him? Now, Lou Boudreau, future Hall of Famer, is in his prime. He's a player manager, not over the hill. And he said after about 5 minutes of trying to hit Satchel Paige in the batting cage, Boudreau agreed that they should sign him.
I want to note too, Ron Kaplan is listening in. He's the author of Hank Greenberg in 1938. And he mentions that Greenberg was instrumental in having the Cleveland team only stay in hotels on the road that would equally serve white and black players.
Right. I wanted to mention that because first off, Larry Doby, I think, was just 3 months after Jackie Robinson made his debut.
In 47. Yeah, that was before my dad was there.
Yeah, but it was summer of 47. So to your point, that Beck was, the humanitarian and wanted to promote the black ball players as well. But there were quite a few on the Cleveland roster. But yeah, when Hank found, there was a story of him seeing some guys on the team go off to another hotel, and they're getting in a cab by the team hotel. He said, "What are you doing?" They said, "Well, we're going to stay over here." And when he learned that they couldn't stay at the same hotel, he was outraged and said, "We got to put an end to that." And so, yes, he was also, I think, looking out for the interests of the black ball players and forward thinking in that regard.
But there's another story too. Hank himself, as an owner, could not check into a hotel. And I think it was in Phoenix. So if you remember my film, I have a scene of Gregory Peck in Gentleman's Agreement to show anti-Semitism, because that was the film depicting anti-Semitism made by a non-Jewish studio head. The Jewish studio heads were not making those films. But that's another story to be shown in my Ben Heck movie that I'm working on now. But the second thing is, I couldn't imagine, I wanted to show, without knowing it, I could talk about it, that Hank himself wasn't allowed to check in. Do you remember what year that was in Arizona? Either Steve or John?
I do not.
Me too.
No, I'd have to
And
look
of
it
course,
up.
to have Gregory Peck in their movie doesn't get better than that.
Another question posted, and again, if you have a question, go ahead and type it into the chat window or click the raise hand button. Question from Stan: are there any awards named in Hank's honor? That could be a way of getting his career noticed.
No Major League Baseball awards.
Right.
Yet. It's a good idea.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see. Great idea. I'm not sure it's going to replace the names that are appropriately attached to the awards that are out there. Good idea. I think that there are plenty of Jewish community centers and ball fields around the country that are the Hank Greenberg Field. And actually, speaking of which, the Tigers at their minor league complex have a field that's named Hank Greenberg Field.
And there's one in Detroit, or at least Sandra Levin and Carol Levin had contacted me about it. Did it ever get made, Steve? There's
Well,
a,
that's the Walk of Heroes that.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, and again, we have a link to photos from the Walk of Heroes and the installation there. I wanted to mention earlier, John, when you were talking about that moment of Hank sitting in the clubhouse in 1934, agonizing over it. The Walk of Heroes is located along the third base side of the field that's there, and I haven't actually looked at the the blueprints versus how it looks now, but that has to be awfully close to the exact place where the clubhouse was, where Hank sat in 34. And as I was there this past summer, I just thought it seemed pretty fitting that the Walk of Heroes is where Hank and his teammates were in that clubhouse, and where Hank sat on that day in 34.
Yeah, fitting place for contemplation about how we live out our beliefs and values and follow our conscience.
And also we have Hank Greenberg posters you can see behind me. I mean, I've met people who said, oh my God, I've had that poster all these years. And there's also still a hat. So it's another way, if you walk around with the people say, well, who is Hank Greenberg? So it's a way to keep the name alive in the story.
There are, when I talked with Ron Kaplan, he mentioned there are current or recent Jewish players who are very aware of this legacy. Brad Osmus and Ian Kinsler, who is it right that he wore didn't wear that number, but he was very aware of the legacy and wanted to honor Hank when he played. I forget what it was that Ron said about his number, because 5 was retired, but that was significant to him in another way.
Well, when I was Sean Green was also a great Jewish player, and his last name had been Greenberg, and I always teased him because I got to know him making the film, and afterwards I said, if your family hadn't changed that name, I would have put you in the movie.
Or maybe you would have made a movie about him with all the other Berg movies to put in there. But yeah, I was going to say about Brad Osmus and Ian Kinsler. Aviva and I did an event at Comerica Park a few years ago on Jewish Heritage Day, and we were down in the field before the game, and Kinsler and Osmus were there as well. And Osmus, of course, a really bright guy, Ivy League graduate, and so they were very aware of Greenberg and his significance and as well. But I remember being in the Twins clubhouse and talking to, and now I'm blanking on his name, a pitcher, I think I want to say Jason Marquise, who was a Jewish ball player. And I mentioned Hank Greenberg to him, and he, blank stare. And so I think there's still work for us to do out there in raising the awareness, wearing the hats and flashing the posters and showing the film, et cetera.
Well, he's actually half Jewish. He also played on the Nats, and I don't think he identified it that much. And I have a picture of that day with me and the 2 players. So, and Brad Osmos is, because he's a catcher and went to an Ivy League school, he's actually in the Mo Berg film, very effectively talking about what it means, to have both. Also, it turns out that Marcus wasn't such a good pitcher. The Learners traded him, but at one point they were very happy to have him.
Any other questions, go ahead and post them. Aviva, before we let you go, let me ask you a little bit about your current work that you spoke about. You're also working, I believe, on a short documentary film about restroom equity in the U.S. Capitol, a building that we've thought a lot about this week. Let me ask you how the pandemic has affected the process of filmmaking. What new challenges has it posed for you?
Well, the film that particular short you're talking about is called Pissed Off, and how the women legislators, of which there were much less when the fight went on, had to fight to have potty parity. That film I decided not to do until COVID ends. So obviously that was very effective, but I'm doing a lot of research. But let me just say that in doing my film about imagining the Indians, mascot, the fight against mascotting, I realized, and certainly in the stories about the Washington football team, that how not only women employees can be exploited, but the cheerleaders, the Washington football team, there was a hidden lawsuit or payoff, and Dan Schneider's being accused of sexism, but of course it's not just this player. That my coworkers and I, the female ones, are starting to, we just had a piece in the Wrap about how oftentimes sexism and racism, can intersect. So I've decided to start a new blog, which probably be out in the next month, called SEW, the word SEW, and it's about sports equality for women. And it'll be all these kind of different stories. I mean, my hat's off to Jeter for his hire for the Marlins. And, I think it's a budding new issue, and I think it's something to be observed. And there's these two young women that work for me that really also have a lot of consciousness about it. So I'm hoping that we can write about any stories you might have, send them to me at the Cheshla Foundation or to the Pissed Off website. So we'll do more on that. But certainly with my Ben Hecht film and even Imagining the Indians, the Squaw Valley just decided to change its name. But luckily they have a cameraman right there on location. So we just interviewed the CEO, Mr. Cohen, and we did it by Zoom. It isn't the same thing, but production is a little slower, but we're getting it done.
Great. Well, we'll look forward to all those projects that you have in the works. I want to thank each of you, Steve, Aviva, and John, for joining us. You've been very generous with your time. We've really appreciated your insights and reflections. Thanks so much to each of you for being part of this.
And thank you for
You're welcome, and thanks for doing it, Nathan.
Right. So wait, I want to hear predictions. Are we going to have a spring training? Are we going to have a full season? What do people think? This baseball fan, I hate hearing all the football talk. I just want baseball.
Looks like we're on track to schedule spring training or to have it occur on time and have opening day occur on time. I think that was the last word that I read. The biggest question to me is capacity in the stands. Will capacity be limited? Will all cities have at least some fans? And I mean, my most pressing question is, when can I personally go to Comerica Park?
Right. You may have to show a card that you got a vaccination.
That's what it takes. I definitely will.
Yeah. But most of all, please make sure you use your mask. And this is for the 51st statehood for DC. It's at the end of all my films, and hopefully it'll be no longer necessary.
Indeed.
And if you remember, the end of Hank Greenberg was a baseball team in Washington. So one of my prophecies worked.
Yeah, with World Series in 2019.
Yeah.
Let me remind all of you again, the DVD of Aviva Kempner's Life and Times of Hank Greenberg. There's a special edition on her website with more bonus features. Hank Greenberg, Hero of Heroes, John Rosengren's biography, really the definitive biography of Hank's life and legacy. I want to thank each of you listening in too. We had a wonderful turnout today, topping out at 52 participants. Many more will be listening to the recording on our website. Really appreciate you all coming together and tuning in and listening to celebrate the story of Hank Greenberg. So thanks to each of you once again, and enjoy the rest of your day. So long.
And that's sharp. May we come back again in my lifetime.
All right.
Thanks, everyone. I really enjoyed it.
Great.
Yeah, thanks again.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thank you too.
Steve and Aviva.
Keep in touch, y'all.